Okay, so today's topic is going to be about SK, specifically SK's run at Epicenter, but it will also be about like the overall evolution of SK throughout the years since they became a championship contender. So all the way back to the end of 2015 when they brought in FNX. And this is going to use that model I introduced a few videos back about assigning Dota 2 roles to CS:GO, and the way it works in Dota 2 is numbers 1 through 5 are all allocated based off of how much gold you get in the game of Dota 2. In the same way, I think resources in CS:GO are allocated from the star or superstar players all the way down to like the supportive end players. Though it's not actually nearly as clear, just because there are players that prefer to play on the supportive end and then there are players that prefer to play on the aggressive end. So in those particular cases, obviously, we're gonna get like really funky numbers compared to like Dota 2, where it's pretty like it's very hard to like jumble up the numbers in that kind of situation, I guess. So first I'll give like test example of what I mean by using this. So I'll go with North, right? So there are two iterations of North in 2017 we should think about. The first one is after they removed Rubino. I guess Rubino left himself, and then AZ came into the lineup. And if you remember how that particular team worked, basically the idea was to make their T sides stronger. And to do that, they moved config to Rubino's role on the wing, but they let him be a playmaker on that side, so he could open up entire parts of the map by himself without any instruction. And this was particularly effective on Cash, where he constantly broke open B by himself and like could single-handedly win T sides for that team on that map. And then Config's old role was to go in second after MSL and execute. So basically, the point of that is MSL entry frags. He baits himself in. So even if he dies, or even if he doesn't get a kill or anything like that, he's creating space and he's creating information for Config to play off of, and to exploit Config's supernatural aim. And when Config was moved to Lurker, this was where AZ was put into, and then AZ, in terms of resources at that point in that particular team, I'd say he was the second most. He had the second most resources, and it didn't really work out. I will say this is like a more complicated issue than it sounds, just because it seems like AZ is like the fundamental problem would be the fundamental problem of their T sides, but actually North's T sides were what made them strong. And I actually think the downfall of their T sides was because they started to play more loose over time, and they moved away from MSL structured style, and that like basically broke them because they didn't have the team or the players to run that kind of style. I'm not actually sure why that happened or why that was the case, but it did happen, and it was the case that I believe that's the reason the T sides of North eventually broke down towards the end. As for the CT side, of course, that's like a whole different set of issues where nobody could fill Rubino's roles adequately. They lacked a true solo anchor until Valde came into the lineup. Now when you look at specifically that North lineup and you look at AZ, you have to say AZ was a problem because he was being given that many resources and he wasn't performing to that kind of level. So that's kind of the second part of like of this model, whereas like you have to look at the resources a player is given, and then how well they perform relative to those resources. So for instance, Taco on SK, he's given almost no resources all the time, so you can't really expect him to be putting down like superstar numbers as a fragger, or even good frag, or even like a good amount of frags most of the time, just because that's his role. Like his role is such that he isn't being put in spots where he's supposed to be killing people. He's being put in like passive spots, in solo anchor spots, and spots where he's not supposed to be killing people. He's supposed to be surviving, and that's the role he's been playing throughout his time in SK. And honestly, I think he's really good at that role. Like a bit underrated overall by the community, but that's a different question. So in the original Magisk lineup with AZ, I felt AZ was a problem, but I don't actually think he's as much of a problem as in this current lineup. And here's why. because they bring in Valde, and the shift from here is they put Valde where Config was playing on the wings, and then they shifted Config back to his original role. And at the same time, they fixed up the T side, MSL's T sides by making it more structured. And I feel this is the key to North as a team. Yeah, Config is a superstar player. Obviously, I think Thorne said he's a top 5 player. Can't really disagree with that. He's an amazing player. But the reason North is winning their T sides, Config is a part of it. But I think the primary reason is because MSL as a leader is amazing. And he's most amazing when he is running these structured, his very like structured style where everybody knows where they're going. He's calling those fast, coordinated hits, and he's bamboozling the CT side with where he's going and how he's like sequencing the different rifle rounds in order to win. And I think that's the key to North's T side. Right, so basically Valde went on the wings, Config is back there, and then where's AZ? AZ is being put more on the supportive end. So at this point, even though I don't actually think he's like a star player in any sense, I think he's doing enough within the resources he's being given and then the roles he's being given in general. And on top of that, I feel like North as a team, like even then I still think like AZ is like the most underperforming player among like relative to like what you expect from the like 5 players on that team. Valde's been good, Config superstar level, Cajun's consistent, but Cajun's a consistent 3rd star. MSL is like a leader. He's actually done decently in his like last 1 or 2 tournaments, but that's not what you should be expecting from him. And then you have AZ, right? And AZ's like used to be a superstar player. He was pretty good. He was okay to pretty good when he was on that weird Kingwin to FaZe lineup, and now he's here. And I actually, like I said, if you want to point out to a single player, I think AZ is the person you point out to, but at this point you can no longer kick him, I think, just because North as a team have proven they've gotten better over time. So I'd rather see them run this course and see how far they can take it before making any drastic step. So lost train of thought, but basically AZ in the Magus lineup, he was being given like 2 resources and he was outputting like a 4, whereas in this current lineup he's being given like the resources of like a 4 player, but he's outputting like a 4 or 5, and that's completely fine. Relative to like where they want to be, like relative to the players they have, I guess that's the better way to put it. So going on into SK, now this is where we're going to really delve into it. So SK has had should I start? Okay, I guess I'll start at the beginning. SK, when they originally created the FNX Taco lineup, the reason was because they believed that the old lineup with boltz and steel could no longer progress into the next level. They were consistently getting into the playoffs, but they couldn't win best of 3s. They were consistently doing good overall in NA, but they couldn't like secure the top spot. And Fallen revealed in an interview, I think it was at Cybersort at Epicenter, that the problem with that lineup during that time, or specifically boltz, I don't know about Steel, but basically said boltz was a player who didn't have that fire within him anymore, or maybe he never had it, where like he was good, but he wasn't willing to change or fix his mistakes. And after giving him a lot of time, they went over to the FNX Taco lineup. Now, in that original lineup, it was a very structured system. I'd say Cold Zero was the one. And okay, so all right, I'll just keep going. So you go into Face It Stage 3 finals, and then this is where they become like a world contending team. I guess that's a good way to put it. Like they were on the cusp, I guess. It would take a few more months until they gained that like level of championship poise that's carried on throughout the rest of their careers. But at the very beginning, it was up in the air as to whether or not they just be like a Na'Vi type of team where they consistently get 2nd place, or like an Astralis type of team they keep getting 4th, or if they were or they legitimately win titles consistently. And as history points out, they ended up being the final one. So in the FNX lineup, I think that's the most traditional, like 1-for-1 balance between the two team between like a Dota 2 resource allocation to like a CS:GO resource allocation. So the one think is coldzera, and the reason I consider coldzera to be the one here is because you have to look at what makes coldzera the best player in the world. And what makes coldzera the best player in the world is he needs a very structured system, and that was a fairly structured system. At the same time, he needs aggressive players to play for him, because coldzera can play make, but that's not his like primary strength. So he has to have. So for coldzera, supportive end players are like 1 or 2 aggressive players, and then 1 or 2 like passive players or teammate players. I guess that's the way I put it. And so for coldzera then like Fur and Fallen were his aggressive like playmakers. Fallen with his op. Fur had like this very weird sort of niche aggressive role where he was only allowed to be aggressive in certain situations and certain areas, but within those areas he was very good. So coldzera was the 1. Fallen is the 2, and the reason he's the 2 is because not only did he have the op, but he was being put in positions to get the first pick. He was being given resources in terms of time, in terms of grenades, in terms of the supportive like elements of the team, like FNX or Taco would help him out often. And then after he'd make the pick, they'd run off the tactics off of him, right? And then this is where it gets a bit complicated, because I know how coldzera wants to play. I know how Fallen wants to play. And then I have to say, I know, but I don't really know how FNX wants to play. I haven't seen like enough of his history prior to this lineup, or even in CS 1.6 if he has like a preferred style. And I don't think he was played long enough in Immortals for me to figure out exactly what his favorite style was. I'd say he was on the passive end though. That's my guess, where he kind of wants to. He's more on the baity side, where he wants like the action to slow down into like the small man situations, and then he makes his plays from there. So as to what his resource allocation, I'd probably say it's like a 4 maybe. Like he wasn't being given like all of the resources of all the positions he wanted, but he was getting some of the stuff he wanted. And then Fur obviously changed himself up, so he was like a 5, but he was legitimately very good. And then Taco was the 6. And what differentiates a 5 and a 6 is a 5 gets some positions he wants, whereas like a 6 gets nothing he wants. And that's basically what Taco was for almost the entirety of this lineup until Epicenter. Next, you go into the Phelps lineup. And there's actually 2 iterations of like the resource allocation for this lineup. The first is the loose style. This is what they used at DreamHack Vegas and then the tournament after that, where like they got to the finals of one tournament, then they bombed out the next. But basically the idea for these 2 tournaments was, okay, we have Phelps. Isn't it kind of a waste to not use Phelps as like as your star player if you're going to get Phelps? That was the theoretical like question for Fallen. And so they decided to play towards Phelps style. So they played a much looser style, and in that style, I'd say the resource allocation was 1, 1, 3, 4, 6. First was obviously Phelps. They were like trying to put him into areas, put him into situations that he was comfortable in, that he could play make from. And then the second was FNX. Not FNX. Sorry, it was Fur. And Fur was a super hyper aggressive player. Like he was just going out there, going super aggressive all the time. And then third was probably coldzera. And the reason coldzera is knocked down in terms of resources from like a 1 to a 3, even though he basically plays the same positions and the same role in both the FNX lineup and the Phelps lineup, is because it was no longer a structured system. So basically, you're taking like this, like a team is structured or a team is loose. That's like a resource in and of itself. And so coldzera can actually play in a loose system, but that doesn't make him like the strongest player in the world. That just like he needs that structured system, and the reason he needs it, I suspect, I don't really know for certain, but I suspect it's because he has such great game sense that if he knows where all the pieces are on the board, he can make all of the best decisions possible. all the best decisions possible, especially when you get down to like the 3v3 situations where I think he's the best player in CSGO, and the only guys who can stop him in that particular situation, I think, is like consistently stop him, I guess, is Astralis when they're very good. Because I think their team play and their coordination is better than most other teams in that kind of situation. Right? So coldzera was the 3, and then Fallen was the 4, and the reason Fallen is the 4 is basically he's given up, at this point he's given up almost all of his aggressive potential. At the same time, he no longer has FNX to help facilitate him for his opping. And then Taco is basically the same as like 6, basically just taking up any roles nobody needs, nobody wants. And then you go into the Phelps structured lineup, which just happens, I guess you'd call it at Summit, is when like it really starts kicking into gear, because at that point they realized that they needed to change something. And the resource allocation of this lineup is 1-1-4-4-6. That's how I'd put it. So 1 is for, he's still basically the same as he always was. The other one is coldzera, and the reason coldzera goes from a 3 to a 1 despite like playing similar roles is, like I said, it goes from a loose system to a very structured system. And all right, I have to point this out as a term. Like, a structured system for Fallen is different from a structured system for MSL. Basically, MSL is like somebody who does control. It feels like he is somebody who like controls where everybody goes at any particular moment, whereas Fallen is somebody who's like, okay, here is my belief in how to play the perfect Counter-Strike with this set of 5 players. I think that's how Fallen thinks about it. And then he teaches this to like the other, teaches this into the other 4 players on his team. Like, first it was Fur, then it was coldzera, then Taco, and then whoever the 5th happened to be at the time, FNX, now Phelps, later boltz, right? And the reason it's different is because after he's like set down the structure of it, he lets them have freedom. Like, he won't micromanage them. He won't say you have to do this, you have to do that. He'll let them have like the choice of action, I guess. And choice of action basically meaning, I'm not going to tell you what to do in every situation, but because you understand my thinking on the way we should be playing the CT side or the T side, and you understand that this thinking is similar to your teammates' thinking, you understand also whether or not this move you're planning to do is a good move for the overall structure of the team. So I think that's the way to think about Fallen compared to MSL. And that's why despite this lineup being like a weird hybrid between like a structured system and like a loose system, in the sense that it's structured but they have freedom, coldzera still gets like a 1 in terms of resources. And fair play to both Fur and coldzera, they basically lived up to that potential. Like, they were fucking crazy during that tournament span where they won everything. And then we go into Phelps and Fallen, and this is where the most conflict happens. Not like personal conflict, but in terms of clash of styles. So Phelps basically sacrificed everything he was as a star player in order to play this particular role, similar to how Fur was in like the first lineup with FNX, where he gave up all of his aggressive potential and he tried to help the team, and then like the team gave him a few bits or pieces like he could do every once in a while, but for the most part he was kind of put on a chain where like Phelps, there's so many F's in this team. So Phelps, like, he's very similar to Stewie in the sense that he loves playing in smokes, or I guess they're both similar to Snacks, I guess. So because of that, like if you want, you can go back and watch those VODs from the Summit on, but basically Phelps isn't nearly as crazy in his smoke plays as he was before on, say, Immortals, and that's because I'm pretty sure Fallen told him to like hold it back, because what was happening with Fallen was he needed some level of support in order for his op to have some level of consistency. So just as Fallen had sacrificed his like aggressive potential so that Fur and Phelps could go crazy, in this sense Phelps had to sacrifice his own just so that the op had more impact in Fallen's hands. And then, you know, Taco still sick, still solid, still basically doing a lot of great team play stuff. And then we go into Epicenter, and obviously it's a bit early, it's only been one tournament, but they did win it And this is a very interesting mix, just because it feels like this is one of those situations where everybody got what they wanted. So I'm not even sure if this number system even works for this team, but I'll explain it. So basically, if you look throughout Epicenter, Fur gets what he wants, which is he's allowed to be super hyper aggressive on both sides of the map, CT side and T side. Cold Zero gets what he wants in the terms of this team is very structured, and he gets more passive. He gets more passive players to aggressive players. Like I said earlier, I think his ideal scenario is he wants 2 aggressive players and 2 passive players on his team. So like the aggressive players, they make the plays for him, and then the passive players, he can play off of them in order to close the round. I think that's the way Cole thinks about it. And then you have Fallen, who's still, I think he's a 3. I actually think Fallen's predilection is more towards the aggressive side than the passive side, even though we've seen him play both. And the reason I think this is because there's like a bunch of like weird plays where he sometimes goes super aggressive with his combat opping. So that's just my guess. I'm not exactly sure. So, and obviously he's not like set up like he was during the FNX lineup days, so that's why I give him a 3 in terms of resource allocation. And then it ends with Taco and boltz. And this is the interesting part, because basically Taco and boltz have like switched changed up a bunch of rules, and apparently it's because Taco got tired of playing site anchor or passive or all this other stuff, all his general positions and roles within the setup So he's basically shifted a bunch of those rounds, and then in his place, basically boltz took up a bunch of the spots that Taco used to play. But the thing is that it seems like boltz wants to play those, and it seems like Taco wants to do this shift. So in reality, like if I had to like guess, I'm assuming it could actually be like a 1-1-3-3-3 or something like weird, right? Because that's the thing about doing this resource allocation, is like it's not necessarily like you could have a situation where I guess you could have a theoretical situation where you have every player gets a little what he wants as a team, but like it rarely happens, and that's why I introduced this system into my own thinking about CS:GO. But in this particular lineup with boltz, it really does feel like he legitimately got, like, boltz as a player legitimately got what he wanted, because by the end of the Immortals lineup with KNG and KNG still in it, and Henny and Lucas, like boltz actually seemed like he was happy playing on the passive end, like he preferred it, and he preferred calling from there. And the reason was because he was no longer he didn't feel as much pressure about doing all the playmaking stuff that he did when like the lineup first initially formed, way back in the days with like before Tempest Storm. So I feel like this current lineup at Epicenter, like boltz is getting a bit of what he wants. Taco is getting what he wants. Fallen obviously got what he wanted because boltz and because either one of 2 players is now facilitating him with their like passive style of play, either Taco or boltz. Cold Zero gets even more of what he wants, and the Fur is still about the same. So I feel like just in terms of resource allocation, in terms of like the rules, in terms of how they fit together, it seems like SK got the right fit for boltz, even though I still think like just in terms of raw potential, I think Phelps will be a superstar one day. Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment of what Phelps can do, but obviously like there's just too much role clash between Fallen, Phelps, and Fur, so that's why they probably went this way. And obviously Phelps was dissatisfied with both his role and his time outside of Brazil. So those are my thoughts about the changes in like the resource allocation for SK throughout the years, and it should be interesting just because with like the rise of SK at this tournament, it makes it very unlikely that FaZe will create an era just because in terms of skill, I think Cold and Fur, between Cold, Fur, and Fallen, I think they have enough skill to meet FaZe most of the time, like head to head. And then obviously there's the whole like entire problem with the map pool, because in their matchup here at Epicenter, like Kerrigan got all of his maps and even despite that, like it ended up being with an SK victory. So it's gonna be very that's the matchup I want to see next in like a month's time or whenever they next meet, because I feel like Kerrigan isn't the type to let a loss go away, but neither is Fallen. So we'll have to see how the evolution and the adaptation goes from there. All right, see you later.